welcome to this video on positive externalities, both consumption and production. This follows our study on negative externalities, and you'll find that the pattern is very familiar. Now that we've already explained what market failure is, and that being lacking the allocative efficient position, even when the free market is occurring, no government intervention is causing this. We have externalities causing this. In this case, positive externalities. Hard to believe that the market is failing when something good is happening, but that's exactly what the theory is all about. And once again, using diagrams and examples, we'll show that how it works. Instead of demerit goods for negative externalities of consumption, we relate how positive externalities of production are actually merit goods, and then how to evaluate the government intervention here to correct this market failure. There are four basic types of government remedies. So first of all, how does it occur? We have a benefit happening in society that is not involved in the private transaction between buyers and sellers. And therefore, the social cost of production in the case of a positive externality of production is less than what it costs private producers. There's a gain. So where there is a benefit to society, the cost is being reduced. And therefore, what's actually failing here is that we're not producing enough. That's basically it. It's not socially desirable to produce so little. And we calculate the social cost, therefore, as being what is the private cost of the producers, and then you subtract the benefits to society. So let's take a look at what we're talking about here. Imagine tourist buildings and old historic buildings. Anybody's restoring that is actually providing a benefit to society, or any kind of positive change for the environment as producers go about their business, and providing jobs or other community services that is actually just what the companies set up for business, but actually all of society benefits because they're training and upskilling the workforce. Well, all of this is actually great stuff that we'd like to see more of, and so that's how, in fact, we can say that the market is failing if we only leave this up to private producers. So in our diagram, once again, we have our marginal private cost, marginal private benefit, the intersection at which is what the quantity would be producing in the free market. In this example, tree planting, any kind of environmentally positive production. And if we have a spillover benefit, then we're subtracting that from the cost. So anytime you have a cost being subtracted from your supply curve, you shift to the right or downwards to the right, because at every price level the cost is less. And so here is where we will draw our new marginal social cost, and there you go. We get the social optimum, which is greater in this case than the market quantity, and that's the sort of thing you expect for any type of positive externality, that the quantity will be to the right of the free market quantity. And in this case, it's not really deadweight loss. We call this potential welfare gain, and that means, once again, that community surplus is not being maximized at Q market. Community surplus will be maximized at Q optimum, and hence a market failure has occurred. Now let's take a look at how positive externalities of consumption work in the market for the consumer side. In this case, we have increased benefits to society once again, but this is in the act of consumption. So just like we talked about for negative externalities of consumption and production, you know the difference between the consumption and the production side because of in the act of which group is doing it that's causing the externality. So if we have consumers actually benefiting society by actually using the product instead of the producers producing the product, then that's where we have consumption benefits. And so the benefits not only just to them, but also to wider society as well. And once again, as in production, we have the market failing because we should have more of this stuff because it's so good for everybody else in society as well. Hence, the social benefit is greater than the private benefit. We'll see how this looks in the diagram. But first of all, what are we talking about here? What is helpful? Well, consumers, that's going to be very helpful for the private homeowner. But the fact that that all homes now are going to be equipped with smoke alarms and perhaps even sprinkler systems and any other type of protection equipment that consumers will have, even security, all these kind of issues, it's actually benefiting everybody because there's less insurance claims that people are paying out and less call outs for fire services and police services, ambulance services. The death and destruction, for heaven's sakes, is huge. So the smoke alarms is actually benefiting much more than the individual buyers. And bicycle helmets, much better than the individual riders because once again, it's actually everything that involves protecting health and safety for individuals means that there is less really waste of human resources, not to mention the human suffering and everything else that's involved in the cost to society of somebody who is injured in the health system, etc. And vaccines. So again, basically we're looking at health and safety issues are very typical of what we're talking about here. And also, keep in mind that this is actually all about merit goods because it's actually good for people. If it's good for people, increasing their health and their safety and their security and their well-being, and all of these things are good for the person, and that makes them merit goods. And then if this is going to be good for wider society, then that's where the positive externalities come in. So pretty much all merit goods are positive externalities of consumption. Now, let's take a look at the diagram. We have our private market quantity here when we're just looking at the MSC and MPB. I use MSC, could use MPC because there's no change. MPC, in this case, MPC equals MSC because there's no externality related to the producers here. It's all related to the consumers. And with the added benefit, then there's the greater benefits than the marginal private benefits. So at per unit benefit, we draw that vertically up, and hence the new MSB is going to be to the right of the MPB. And yes, you'd guess it, that we have our potential welfare gain that can be illustrated there. So the greater total surplus in the market is available when we produce at a higher quantity. And again, this is not showing how, in fact, we have a solution. We're just saying, here's the problem here. This is why we know market failure is occurring, because we are not producing at QSD. So very important to have that clear in your mind before we do our next step, which is about how do we start solving this sort of thing? How do we get from what should still be labeled there is Q market to Q socially desirable, or QAE allocative efficient? How do we get there? There we go. Sorry about that. I should have had a few of those items already listed there. So we want to know how we get to where MSC equals MSB, where there's a socially desirable quantity. All right, let's go back to production, PEP, positive externalities of production. Now, remember how subsidies work. Okay, and this is our first level of, and the very basic level of applying government revenues. You always think, well, if we want to produce more of it, throw in a subsidy. Yeah, why not? It's good for consumers, good for producers. Yep, that's great. You know what that looks like. That's shifting the supply curve. In this case, you're talking about shifting the MSC or the MPC, shifting it to the right in order to get to the socially desirable equilibrium. Lower price for consumers, more quantity for producers at a higher return for them, so it's all win-win for them. However, got to keep that in mind that it's hard to really estimate how much the government should be really providing. Are they actually targeting subsidies that actually end up with the correct amount for what the socially desirable outcome quantity should be? And then even if they do, it's actually taking government money, and you know that that means that the government cannot spend it elsewhere, and that's an opportunity cost. Alternatively, even if they were to borrow money or if they were to raise taxes, still an opportunity cost. Nothing's a free lunch. So you have to keep that in mind, evaluating, and that's just simply a reasoned judgment as to what it would be best for society overall. Another type of remedy is subsidizing, same idea really, but for consumers. So if it's all about for consumption, that it's consumers consuming healthy products, well, then let's have them lower price by having a subsidy. And once again, it's a matter of being able to afford that. So the same issues in subsidies for production is the subsidies that we have for consumers. But keep in mind with one other aspect here that we could mention is that quite often we're talking about developing countries, and you'll see that in section 4, very expensive to do and cannot really afford to do that kind of subsidies for consumers. Anyhow, what else could be done? Well, we could actually advertise or educate. So if you think about healthcare products, well, all right, let's encourage people to use them. Let's educate people to use them. And you'll know that that's been happening with a number of products, and that's great. In this case, we're not shifting the MSC to the right, we're shifting the MPC because we're getting consumers to have a higher preference for demand, and that would result in the socially desirable quantity. Well, hopefully, again, is how much can that MPC curve actually shift? And how expensive will that be? How effective will it be? How expensive will it be? And that's the sort of thing you'd have to evaluate once again with some reasonable level of judgment. How about this? The government providing it for free. And indeed, that's what governments do. They'll say, hey, this is so good, we won't even leave this up to the private sector, or we'll get in there into the market ourselves and do a little bit of our own provision. And so that's where you get the government involved in business, in providing goods and services. And this is exactly the whole rationale for it. It's where you are trying to really control costs and not just throw money at producers. They'll control the costs by maintaining control of provision themselves. How about legislation? Well, the government can pass laws. Now, it can be effective in certain cases. Vaccinations can be a little bit tricky, but the government really needs to provide that free of charge for it to be effective. So you have to keep that in mind. It's a combination there. Helmet provision for bicycles may be just up to legislation. So really, it's a huge amount of just common sense. You just can't throw legislation at people and say, yes, you must buy this product. You know, people not necessarily going to do that. How are you going to enforce that is a big issue. Infringement on their civil liberties is an issue. But take the case of wearing seatbelts. That's a law, and that was able to be enforced. It's pretty easy to enforce for police, and so that shift was able to occur without providing any subsidies whatsoever. Cars simply had to have all automobile makers had to have all cars outfitted with seat belts and of course even more protective equipment, and it's a done deal, easily inspected. So wherever you're trying to apply remedies from the government, it's got to be just some common sense evaluating going on here. So please don't forget that. You just can't throw any kind of remedy no matter what. And indeed, are you going to have legislation for producers in cases, or advertising for producers? Who's going to advertise to producers to produce in a certain way? It's not as though they've got a conscience about what is going to be happening in society. Merit goods do not benefit producers, so you're not going to, quite often, for production possibilities of positive externalities of production, you're not going to have advertising or education being involved there. So that's about it. There's 4 types of of government remedies, and you just use your common sense when you're evaluating what would be the most effective type of remedy, and also considering the lowest opportunity cost.